Section 7, and we represent Fiji. One vulnerability Fiji would have is a rise in sea level, and that would affect people and businesses near the coast and lowlands of Fiji. Sensitivity is very high since most of Fiji lies at low elevations. This would affect coastal habitats, cause erosion, and contaminate water and soil. The majority of the economy also comes from tourism, so buildings near the shore would need to move. Ocean acidification is another vulnerability. Coral reefs and the shellfish population would be affected, and sensitivity is moderately high. The coral reefs wouldn't be able to survive in acidic conditions, and shellfish can't form their exoskeletons. Flooding would also affect Fiji. This would affect low-lying areas of the islands, and sensitivity is very high. Flooding can cause degradation of ecosystems, and people with damage to homes would have to find resources to rebuild or move somewhere else. A decrease in fresh water would also affect Fiji. Freshwater sources where salt water could contaminate the source would be affected, and sensitivity is moderate. The spread of diseases would be another vulnerability. Water supplies and people living in overpopulated areas would be affected. The sensitivity is high because a lot of people can't afford the needed health care. People would have to stop working and children might not be able to attend school. Hospitals might become overpopulated as well. Fiji would also experience more intense weather patterns, and that would affect everywhere on the islands. Sensitivity is high, and they're located close to where a lot of hurricanes form. Homes and crops would be destroyed, and people might need to relocate. The salt content of the soil would also increase, and that would affect lower elevations on the island. The sensitivity is high because a big part of the economy is growing food. It would also cause the reduction of water quality, and the agricultural business of the islands at a low altitude would lose money and might not be able to operate. One opportunity for Fiji is a growing renewable energy industry, and that would affect anyone who uses the energy, and they could come up with cheaper methods of energy. $1 in $7 in Fiji is spent on oil, but they've come up with projects, and 60 small loans have been approved to install solar panels in homes and businesses. The country plans to have 100% of its energy from renewable sources by 2030. This project will also provide training to small enterprises and community organizations on equipment repair and maintenance, general business skills, and analyzing market trends.
The other opportunities for Fiji is increase in food production in higher altitudes, because which gonna encourage farmers to plant crops stay above sea levels, and the Pacific, including Fiji's, would be able to export more products to the world, and which gonna increase the jobs in Fiji and the country's food supply. And also, many people hear some beautiful place in Fiji gonna disappear, which without increase in tourism, and which directly affect from the country's economic, there would be more job available. And for Fiji's economic before the Industrial Revolution was mainly depend on sugar cane production, and it didn't change much after the Industrial Revolution because Fiji is not an industrial country. But in a period of global imperialism, the Britain colonized Fiji, and the Australian colonial sugar refining company was invited to extend its operations in Fiji. And after that, the Fiji's greenhouse gas emitted has been largely increased. And for fossil fuel emissions, in early 1980s, there is a peak because of the Fiji's tourism industry expanded rapidly, and which is leading economic activities in this island. And in last 10 years, there also been a large increase in the amount of carbon released in the atmosphere due to the fact that there has been an increase in clothing and sugar factory in Fiji. And Fiji's overall emission compared to other countries, you can see in this graph, the China's overall emissions is already more than 10 million kilotons, but Fiji is just 1,070 kilotons. So compared to other countries, Fiji's overall emission is comparatively low.
All right, so Fiji is made up of roughly 56% of forested area, and 90% of that belongs to the indigenous people of Fiji. So they have a lot of regulations in terms of who they can and can't sell their land to. So the indigenous people lease their land to others, but they can't actually sell it to them unless it's the state of Fiji. And whoever owns the land is the one who gets to decide whether or not trees can be cut down there. The main drivers of deforestation in Fiji are commercial and small-scale agriculture. Fiji's government controls whether or not certain areas can be cut down and are in charge of protecting areas from unplanned deforestation. They started to implement a national forest monitoring program, so they limit the amount of deforestation that can actually be done in the country. Some of the dominant lifestyles in Fiji, most of the people here are farmers or fishermen. Some people live in cities that work within the tourism industry, sugar, clothing, or mining industry. Most of the people that do live in Fiji live below the poverty line and rely on the land and each other to survive. There's very few actually rich people living in Fiji. The two lifestyles produce two very different carbon footprints. The majority of Fiji compose those in poverty, and they give off a really low proportion of the carbon footprint, where the rich have a much larger carbon footprint. But overall, Fiji has a really small carbon footprint since the majority of them are below the poverty line. It's a huge threat for Fiji, though, because most people can't afford to move away from the rising ocean levels, as well as byproducts to protect themselves from the diseases that are starting to be spread. They also can't afford to buy food, and so they start growing it on themselves or for themselves. Vulnerable populations in Fiji, like I said, the indigenous populations are vulnerable because the majority don't live in the big cities. They live in rural areas where it's tougher to deal with the effects of climate change. Poor populations have a tough time dealing with the effects of climate change because they don't have money to deal with the adaptations. Women are vulnerable from the effects of climate change because most of their everyday life they're fetching water for their families, and that's where the majority of diseases come from in Fiji. And then children are a big part of vulnerable populations because they need more resources to grow, like food and water, and they're more vulnerable biologically to diseases and changes in their lifestyle. So some of the things that we've come up with that Fiji could implement is building levees in low elevations. Flooding is a big problem in Fiji. Towns and cities can be flooded by intense rain or sea level risings. So the pros is that it's cheap to build and can stop water. However, if it's breached, it can cause more damage from flooding than it would happen if the levee was never really built there. They can develop irrigation and drinking water reservoirs. The increasing sea levels can cause saltwater to contaminate freshwater sources. And the pros for that would be that people in Fiji would have access to fresh water and farmers could keep plants alive and well. However, the cost of irrigation systems and creating drinking water reservoirs can be pretty high. A solution that can be seen is people can move away from the coast. The sea level rise is flooding large areas of the coast, and in preparation for this, Fiji could begin to relocate people to other areas of the country. The pros is that people's homes will not be flooded and damaged if they do move. However, many people may not want to leave their homes, or people who live off the resources on the coast could no longer have access to those materials if they did move. People would kind of have to adapt to a new climate and environment there. They could have infrastructure updates to prevent damage from intense weather patterns, which can destroy buildings and homes. Pros is raising the roads and coast will allow travel and reduce the impacts when there are floods. Buildings with improved structure to deal with stronger storms. However, building new structures or reinforcing old ones will be really expensive for those living in Fiji. A lot of people will be temporarily out of housing. Another adaptation could be educating farmers on what plants will grow in new conditions. With increasing temperatures and increased salt levels in the soil, many crops will start failing to grow, and so new crops will be needed to grow in these new conditions. Pros for this is that farmers will be able to adapt the crops grown to the climate change effects. However, research would need to be done to know which crops will grow best under Fiji's new conditions. It'll also take time and money to educate the farmers enough. Fiji ratified the UNFCCC in 1993 and became a signatory of Kyoto Protocol in 1998. In 2006, Fiji committed to reaching a target of 60% energy from renewables. And in 2012, Fiji pushed for a second commitment for themselves and for industrial countries that are causing the majority of climate change. And with regards to the Paris Agreement, Fiji was actually the first country to ratify the Paris Agreement, and the measures Fiji's taking will reduce CO2 emissions by 30%. And one of their plans is they plan to invest more money into renewable energy projects, and they plan to be at 100% renewables by 2030, and they're currently at about 60% renewable.
Fiji joined the United Nations Millennium Declaration in September of 2000, and this resolution was adapted by countries in the United Nations and includes some environmental protection rules. Some of these are spare no effort to free future generations from living on a planet whose resources are not sufficient for their needs, to reaffirm support for the principles of sustainable development, and to adopt in all environmental actions a new ethic of conservation. Fiji is also part of the Barbados Plan of Action, and that's a program that addresses the priority areas of small island nations, and it sets specific strategies for short and long-term support of the sustainable development of small island nations. Some priorities include climate change and sea level rise, natural and environmental disasters, management of wastes, and coastal and marine resources. Fiji is also part of the Pacific Islands Development Forum, and this prioritizes balancing economic growth, social development, and environmental sustainability, and it's the first participatory platform on green economy, and it has the following legal capacity in Fiji. They can enter into contracts, acquire and dispose of movable and immovable property, institute and respond to legal proceedings, and take other such actions necessary for the fulfillment of its purpose and activities.
The AOSIS is an intergovernmental organization of low-lying coastal and small island countries, which is established in 1990s, and the main purpose of this alliance is to consolidate the voices of small island developing states to address global warming. For some low-lying states, the risk from sea level rise threaten their physical existence. For other states, their socio-economic viability will be compromised. And the PIFACC is established in 2005, and the goal of this framework is to ensure Pacific Island people build their capacity to be resilient to the risk and impacts of climate change, with the key objective to deliver on expected outcomes under the following interlinked theme.
One of our recommendations for Fiji is to continue their restrictions on deforestation. Another recommendation is to set up an organization that can monitor the rise in sea level. Their job would be also to come up with the adaptation methods for the vulnerable populations. Another recommendation is for Fiji to reach 100% renewable energy by 2030. Seeing as they already reached 60%, this should be a fairly easy goal for them. Since Kyoto, Fiji has been involved in conserving their forests through state laws and restrictions on who can lease the land and have control over their forests. This involvement in maintaining the country's forests helps keep large industries out of Fiji and further controls the amount of emissions contributing to global climate change. Fiji should push to have the monitoring organization established in other small countries and those that are being impacted the most by climate change. That way, the more vulnerable countries have better adaptation plans as they become more impacted by the effects of climate change. Another recommendation to Fiji is to place a tax on the companies contributing to the climate change. This tax will be in effect until Fiji has made the transition to 100% renewable energy. Those companies will be taxed with 6% of their income per year. The money that is taken from the tax will be used by the government to change Fiji's energy resources and implement new renewable energy sources as well. Companies will start to move towards renewable energy for themselves so they don't have to pay the tax. This shouldn't take very long, seeing as how Fiji has already reached 60%, as I mentioned before, in renewable energies. Half of this tax will go towards the adaptation organization monitoring the sea level rise, and the other 3% will be used towards transitioning to the renewable energies. The possible negative of this tax would be that companies would most likely lower employee wages in order to save money. This would cause vulnerable populations to become potentially more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. However, the 3% used to help those populations adapt to climate change should help them, and this could entail new farming methods and other ways of helping them with the burden of loss of income. So most of the country will be very vulnerable to climate change. There's a small percentage, probably not even 0.5%, that wouldn't be affected by climate change because they have the income, but most of Fiji is in poverty, so they will all see some effect from climate change. Since Fiji has already been extremely involved in climate change negotiations, our recommendations won't affect the daily lives of the vulnerable populations very much, except for the organization that will monitor sea levels and provide adaptation plans. The establishment of the organization will affect the vulnerable populations in a positive manner. The money used is not coming from the vulnerable populations, so they will reap the benefits of the adaptation plans with no cost.